Good evening. My name is Peter Politis. I'm the executive director at Dallas Center for Photography. We are a nonprofit that basically believes in the power of photography. In normal times, we have a full slate of workshops, classes, uh, gallery exhibits in a really beautiful gallery that is dark right now. So right now we have moved online like everybody else. One of the upsides is it's resulted in some really interesting ideas for webinars. And this one tonight, so far, I think might be the most interesting. We're going to be talking about the Hall of State, about Polly Smith, a photographer. We've got a group of very interesting people to talk this over and give you different perspectives on it. And in just a second, I'm going to go through and just read a very short bio so you have a sense of who these people are. I want to say right now that we will have a little bit of time at the end for some Q&A. You'll notice that there is no chat feature turned on tonight, but we do have a Q&A feature. If you have something you want to know more about, go ahead and put it in there and we'll choose some questions to answer at the end. So let me start with Valletta Forsyth Lill. She is a former member of the Dallas City Council and a longtime community advocate. She's played multiple roles in the development of the cultural and physical city and the policy that's guided it. She's created and served as executive director of the Dallas Arts District and served on numerous nonprofit boards from the Dallas Museum of Art to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And she is actively engaged in this $14.7 million restoration of the Hall of State. As a mutual friend said when he told me about Valletta, if it's got anything to do with art in Dallas, Valletta's there. Lizanne Gann is an independent conservator of works of art on paper and photographic materials. She holds degrees from Southern Methodist University, the State University of New York College at Buffalo, and the Sorbonne in Paris. She consults with private and institutional clients locally and internationally to preserve fine art and historical artifacts. Ms. Gann previously worked for the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Rodin Museum, the Williamstown Art Conservation Center, the Preservation Institutes in France and Netherlands, and established the Conservation Lab at the Nationale Fotorestauratie Atelier in Rotterdam. She's now based in Dallas. Evelyn Barker, say hi, is a proposal writer for iStation, an educational software company located in Dallas. Previously, she was a librarian at the University of Texas at Arlington and the Dallas Historical Society. She is the author of A Texas Journey, the Centennial Photographs of Polly Smith, and she has also co-authored 4 books about Arlington, Texas. She has curated many exhibits at the UT Arlington Library, and she has a MLS at the University of North Texas in Denton. Lynn Rushton, Dallas Public Art Collection and Conservation Manager, oversees a collection valued at more than $100 million, spanning from newly commissioned works to heritage sites stretching across every district and neighborhood in the city. She's part of the restoration team to return the Texas Hall of State to its condition upon its opening. If any of you have been to Fair Park and been to the Hall of State, it's a spectacular building. It is way more spectacular now after these renovations that are going on. She holds a BFA in fine art, painting, and a BA in communication from Vanderbilt, an MA in education from Texas Tech, and completed graduate work at Tulane. Ellen Leathers Wishart, and I hope I just said that correctly. Did I, Ellen?
You were very close.
Wizard?
Wishart.
Wishart. Ellen Leathers Wishart is a Dallas photographer whose love of photography began, I just know her as Ellen, that's the problem, began with a film camera that was a gift from her father on her 12th birthday. She was fascinated by the ability to preserve a single moment in time by capturing light on film. I totally get that. She holds a BFA in photography from the Maryland Institute College of Art and with a BFA, sorry, we already said that, and she's worked as an aerial photographer in both Oregon and Texas, which I find pretty fascinating. Along with photography, Ellen has explored various other types of creative work from oil painting to carpentry. Both skills that I would say flow into this next point, that she's always been enchanted by the striking quality and magic of wet plate collodion. In 2015, she learned the process herself, and in spring of 2018, designed and built her own mobile photography studio. The Tintype studio is located off of Lower Greenville in Dallas, where Ellen offers authentic tintype portraits by appointment. So those skills of oil painting and carpentry, you were just getting yourself ready. That's who we have with us tonight. And we're going to start with Valletta Lil. And she is going to kind of take us into this world of Hall of State restoration and how this ended up getting tied in with this remarkable collection of photographs by this intrepid young woman from 1936, who I was an assignment photographer for most of my life. And this work that she got to do in 1936, it was a pretty sweet gig. She got to travel the state for 4 months and take some pretty groundbreaking images. So I find this story super fascinating. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Valletta.
Well, thank you for being here tonight. It's a pleasure to have all of you with us. I think Fair Park has been one of my favorite places since the day I arrived in 1985. I love its history, I love its art, and I love its architecture. And those are the three things we'll be touching upon tonight. Going into some brief Centennial history. Well, the state fairgrounds have been around since 1886, and Fair Park has been a city park since 1904. And in fact, there had been ideas floating around about doing the Centennial for decades before the 100th birthday. The idea of hosting a Centennial was a game changer in 1934 when we were discussing it. The Depression-weary residents saw the Centennial as a way to introduce both Dallas and the rest of the state to a carefully curated, romanticized version of the way we saw ourselves. Half of Texas depended on cotton crops at the time of the stock market crash in 1929. And while oil and gas had been discovered, recently kind of overproduction resulted in the commodities losing value and our economy losing steam. In 1934, the legislature took action to create a Texas Centennial Commission and to offer to host the Centennial to essentially the highest bidder. Dallas, of course, knows how to go big and won with a $7.8 million bid and the use and expansion of Fair Park and, yes, an esplanade. Peter, let's roll a video for opening day of 1936.
My friends of Texas, I have come here today to bear the tribute of the nation to you on your 100th birthday, for you are 100 years young.
And what a birthday party! A huge $25 million exposition in Dallas with all Texas playing host. 200 acres of magnificent buildings, a new city, a great city, a city of 1,000 sights and 1,000 wonders. Small wonder then that the whole nation is talking about this big Texas exposition.
Once the legislature determined the location of the Centennial, 41-year-old George Dahl would be hired as the architect in charge. Dahl and his team were to oversee the design of everything from the main buildings to the hot dog stands to the utility locations. The crown jewel would be the State of Texas building. Former Governor Pat Neff stated, quote, "Like the Alamo, the San Jacinto battlefield, and other sacred spots, this is not the property of the Centennial or of Dallas, but to be held by trust by them for all the people of Texas. Of course, this is the same guy that referred to the building when it was opened as the Westminster Abbey of the New World. The Texas legislature allocated $1.2 million for building construction, $1 million to construct the building, and $200,000 for fine finishes in the building. That's about $4 million in today's dollars. But with all things, there are politics involved. And in June of 1935, 1 year before the opening, the state took control of the design of the building away from Dahl and gave oversight to the Board of Control in Austin. All right, I'm trying to get it to go to the next one. Peter, can we go to the next slide? There we go. It had gone over to the Board of Control in Austin, and failed attempts to secure approval for the design led to the recruitment of Donald Bartholomew of Houston. He was told in a call from Mark Lemon that he could have the commission if he could be in Dallas the following day. Upon arrival, he was further told there had been 4 failed attempts for approval of the plans, and they suspected a 5th would be rebuffed. Bartholomew spent days reworking the drafts and finally was able to secure the approval. Okay. Next slide. This was the design that Bartholomew first put out, which you will notice is the basic Hall of State today, with the exception there are 2 wings on the sides, obviously, that were never built. Okay, next slide. This is the way it looked on opening day. However, the building itself was not open on June 6th. The building did not open until September of 1936, halfway through the Centennial. If you look at this render or this photograph of the building, there are elements that are in front of the building today that are not here and did not end up on the building until a year or so later. You'll note the torchieres and lanterns are not there. There are actually benches out front that Lynn and I are still looking for and not been able to find. The Historical Society moves in 1938. Okay, next slide. This is the Esplanade as it looks today. And over the years, bond referendums have been passed for work in Fair Park, including in the 1985 in preparation for the sesquicentennial, all the way to 2017, which is the current work is being done under that referendum. Next slide.
Valletta, you should be able to take control now.
All right. This is the way that the building looked before work had started. You can see the building had not been cleaned for decades, some crumbling in the steps. But in November of 2017, the bond passes and $14.4 million plus money from the State Fair of Texas to bring it to $14.7 million is included for the restoration of the Hall of State. This is the way it looked as they moved in for construction. The exterior scaffolding is there for the purpose of cleaning the building, which took almost a year. And this is the way it looks today. Remember that the materials are all Texas native materials. This is Texas limestone. This is the way it looked before. This is the way it looks today. But it was not only the exterior of the building. It was a necessity of doing the work of maintaining, conserving, or preserving many of the artists' works on the interior of the building. Paint and art conservators worked to determine proper coloring. You'll see in this particular photograph, the ceiling is a blue that's meant to emulate Texas skies. The green exterior of the windows, that was from 1936 and had been painted over some years ago. There's the blue. The chandeliers were all polished and cleaned. There had been mistakes over time, including painting of some bronzes, etc. This is a door before with paint conservator Yanni Younger. And that's the same doors after conservation. This is what was in 1936, a fountain that was a planter for the last 30 years. It's now being restored, and there'll be fountains, and the tile has been restored. All the tiles that are intact are in one of the fountains. The other side is all new and emulated new tile. This is the best workroom that you could ever have. These are the workers currently working on doors, etc. The plans. All of these doors had to be redone, some of them untouched since 1936, and what you will find in this is everyone had to be marked, every plate of glass, down to the smallest detail, because of the curvature of the building. None of the parts are interchangeable. This is more work on the building. These are the grills and from the front doors that you see, and these were restored to their 1936 glory of kind of the highlights like a woman's hair. So it's multi-dimensional, and they had been painted over or tarnished over time. This is the ceiling, which literally the paint was peeling off, including the aluminum leaf. These are the doors restored and reinstalled. More of the doors. Chandeliers were all completed. This is my favorite in the South Texas room because that is a look of a spaceship. Conservators looked at several pieces, including this is in the South Texas room. This is aluminum leaf. And Lynn and I are here with Marcel Quimby, who's the architect, historic preservation architect working on the building. And we had to bring conservators from the Getty because this aluminum leaf is so rare. This is the way they look on the walls. And then finally, this is where there is a need for conservation. I think the thing that I'm amazed by every day is the artwork in this place, from Allie Tennant's Tejas Warrior to the many murals in the park. Fair Park was the hub of working artists during the construction and afterwards. The Depression is still known for the artists who worked in that era, And I'm now going to turn it over to someone who knows a great deal about the art, the artists, and the collection, Lynn Rushton.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Valletta. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the cultural and heritage history that is related to Polly Smith's oratones and the rest of the artwork that we'll be viewing in this presentation. So let's cue the slides. So photography in the Centennial. So we're really going to focus on what that meant and how it meant for Polly Smith as a individual artist, and also what kind of influences were heading her in that way, and kind of that zeitgeist, the spirit of the time. So next slide. So can we have, yeah, perfect. So I've been brought in by the historic preservation architect when she let me know that much of the many of the cultural objects of the Hall of State were going to be touched in this bond package. So windows, doors, light fixtures, all of those things were going to be moving around in these rooms. And I became deeply concerned about these glass objects that were stuck in the wall that had photos on them, and I didn't know what they were. Next slide. So my instinct was to go ahead and bring a conservator in to do an assessment. So I called Lizanne Gann, and she will be talking to you about the technical aspects about these things, but we didn't know what they were. So when she came on her day for the assessment, she walked in and she looked surprised. And I asked her, you know, what had caused that reaction. And she said she was actually expecting 5x7 images, very small things. And as you'll learn, these are quite large. And she asked me how many there were. And I said 18 all done in 1 year by a woman. Next slide. And we already had women who were working in the Centennial, as mentioned before. We have Dorothy Austin, who designed the doors that are on the front of the building. She also worked on this contrapposto Western cowboy in the West Texas room. She was a local artist who, along with, the next slide, Allie Tennant, who did the Tejas Warrior, were working alongside the male artist at the Centennial. This is important, next slide, because Polly Smith then takes her place among these women artists who were working on this fantastic building. And as far as we know at this point, Polly Smith is the only woman who has two-dimensional works that are in the art program cycle of the Hall of State. Next slide. And I'm going to go back a little farther than Valletta did. And I'm going to tell you that the Centennial exhibition was, in fact, the brainchild of a group of advertisers who had gathered in East Texas, in the booming oil town of Corsicana. And they had gotten a speaker to come down, and he rallied the troops, and they decided that they were going to host this exhibition. And as you can see, it was in a speech that was titled "What Texas Has to Advertise and How to Advertise It." And they decided that every county was going to have to participate in this birthday party that Texas was going to throw and invite the world. And what that meant was they compelled the counties to participate, and most counties participated with a sculpture in front of their courthouse. And most of those sculptors were sculptors that worked at the Centennial. So we have this advertising, this promotion, what one book called the pride and patriotism and self-interest of Texans to create this exhibition. Next slide. So I just wanted to kind of run you quickly through kind of the culture that was happening. So here we have 1925 San Antonio, early music streaming. Next slide. And in 1931, people streaming on a bank run. So the Depression has happened. Next slide. And it's captured by photography. You know, we start to see the distress of the American people through these images. Next slide. And things get worse, you know, as people are displaced and there's not food for people. bad things continue to happen, like the jackrabbit plague. Next slide. Worse for the jackrabbits. Next slide. And so we have FDR, who's coming up with New Deal plans, and he wanted to be able to help people understand what Americans were going through. And he established the Resettlement Administration, and that is the precursor to what would be the Farm Securities Administration, which then became what we all know as the WPA. So this is super important because photography then takes front and center, telling the stories and narratives of people who need help and how the government is helping them. Next slide. So we're just going to quickly kind of move through these resettlement photographers and look at how they are capturing the American people's lives. Many of the photographers, as we'll see, are shooting the ordinary people, what their lives look like. Next slide. So here we have Walker Evans, who I always think kind of has a Hopper-esque quality to his detachment to these what we would call little country towns, but were kind of urban country scenes. Next slide. And then like Gordon Parks taking pictures of DC. Next slide. And all of this is important because it's giving a voice through these photographic images to what is going on. Next slide. So we're going to stop here for a second and we're going to talk a little bit about somebody that you do know, Dorothea Lange, and what her parallels are to Polly Smith, who you probably don't know a lot about. But there are a lot of similarities in the two women artists who both of them went around the country and took images of what was happening in the region with an eye for kind of social ills or social justice. What could we do to help these people? And one of the important things that we're going to kind of use as a hook is both Dorothea Lange and Polly Smith went to the same photography school. Next slide. And that photography school was run by a man named Clarence White, and he believed things that were kind of radical, like ordinary people could have an education, or that artists should be able to make a living wage. And so one of the things that he did with his photography students throughout the 20s is he helped them work for kind of travel magazines and food magazines in New York. And as kind of the 20s waned and we moved into the 30s with that economic distress, many of those artists went on to work for the government in this resettlement administration. Next slide. And what's important is as we're thinking about the Centennial and its kind of roots in this effort to have advertising and photography, is that the Centennial exhibition, unlike any of the other kind of world fairs that were going on, focused on agriculture. So here is the probably most distressed area in the country, agriculture, and the Centennial is going to talk about it. Next slide. And so Polly Smith, who is taking these kind of images of telling these stories of the common people, is surrounded. So she's at the Centennial exhibition in the Hall of State, and then the Resettlement Administration sends an exhibition of photography and information to help people understand what the government's doing to help with resettlement. And it is also present at the Centennial exhibition in 1936. So they kind of, these photographers are together at the Centennial. Next slide. So I want to then say that Polly was an artist. All these photographers were artists. And when she went to the Clarence White School, one of the things that they helped do is teach her technique, which we'll hear about in a little bit, but they also taught composition. And so Clarence White was deeply influenced by a man named Arthur Dow. And here we have his book. It was written in 1914, but was very influential in 1920 and 1930. And if you'll look at these little side images that I'm pointing to that you can't see over to the right hand of your screen, those compositions are cropped images that remind us of Japanese woodblock prints, which Dow was an expert in. Next slide. So Clarence was very influenced by his friend Dow. And if we're going to look just a moment at these Japanese prints. So if you look at them, These are Hiroshige, so these would be things that artists in the 30s would have seen. They have a tipped up perspective. The center of interest is in the foreground, not the middle ground or background. It's often in the lower corners, and there is some kind of structure in the back side of the image to kind of keep your focus forward. So if you look at the next slide, we're going to have 3 images just to kind of illustrate this. So the top image is Dow, the man who wrote the book. The bottom image is Polly Smith, the person we're here to talk about. And to the right is Polly Smith's teacher, friend of Dow, who had the photography school that that Lange and Polly Smith attended. So if you look at it, it looks so similar in composition. It's a cropped image. It's tight on the subject matter. The subject matter is in the lower foreground. And there is some kind of grid-like structure, the houses or this engineering fabrication, whatever it is, and or the window, whatever that is, some machinery. So very similar, very influential in the way she composed her pictures. Next slide. So I just wanted to give you a little overview of the culture and background of what Polly Smith would have known about and seen, all the artists that were around her, how photography was really important to the Centennial in both Polly Smith's work and then the work of the Resettlement Administration, who was showing people how they could survive in the Depression. I just wanted to say goodbye from the most photographed women in the United States in 1936, the Texas Centennial Rangerettes. And that's all. We can watch how they chose them in this quick video if you would like. So here they are when they're being picked for the Centennial. And by the end, they really were the most photographed women in the world. Well, in the US. And aren't we lucky we don't have to go back to 1936?
Thank you very much. That is the first time I saw that video. I was like, am I seeing what I think I'm seeing? So yeah. Next up, we have Evelyn. And I love photography books. This is an awesome book, not just of photography. This is Polly Smith's photography, but also the history of her family, her as a woman, her as an artist. And the author is going to tell you all about it. I had an earlier call with her and I was kind of riveted by this entire story. So I'm going to fire up the screen here again and let Evelyn take it away.
All right, thank you, Peter. So I wanted to just start off, as Peter showed you, this is the cover of the book, A Texas Journey. And, you know, this is taken in Kilgore. This photo is taken in Kilgore. And I thought, you know, I should share why we chose this photo for the cover. And the obvious reason, of course, would be, you know, the book's titled A Texas Journey. And so here you have cars and a road and, you know, this whole scene that's kind of this perfect 1936 moment. But the real reason it was chosen, and let me go over here. Drum roll, we're going to keep the suspense going. There it goes. Because it answers the question, why did the chicken cross the road? To get to the Jack's beer. So there you go. That's the behind the scenes story of the cover. As ever, I'm so honored to be talking about Polly Smith tonight. And of course, this is Polly over here and her sister Flo. Now, Polly died in 1980, and so I never met her, but she and her family have been with me for literally half my life at this point. I'm a librarian, as Peter said. I was a librarian at the Dallas Historical Society. That was my first job out of library school, and I absolutely loved it. And as a librarian, nothing makes me happier than tracking down a research question. I will go down that research rabbit hole in a second. And really, that's how my relationship with Polly started in 1994 at the Dallas Historical Society. I was one of the librarians, and one day my colleague and fellow librarian Galen Pilati called me over, and he was laying out these black and white photos on the desk, and we were just like, wow, these are awesome. And he found them in the Texas Centennial collection. So we were oohing and awing. And at that time, many years ago, there was no finding aid to the collection. And the collection was over 300 boxes. So finding anything in that collection was kind of a serendipitous event. And serendipity actually comes into play a lot with my relationship with Polly. But Galen and I both thought the photos were just fascinating. So we didn't know anything about them. We turned them over, and the only thing that was there was the name Polly Smith stamped on the back. That's what we had. So we decided to find out who Polly Smith was. Now, if you had told me then I would spend the next 25 years answering that question, that might have ended it right there. But we were blessedly young and naive. So we started going. And we got really lucky early on, because one of the DHS board members at the time was Hortense Sanger. And we were mentioning this to her. And she turns to me and says, oh, would you like to talk to Polly's sister? I have her address. Like, okay, serendipity. So we were able to get in touch with Gail Muscovich right here. This is Gail. And of course, this is Polly over here. And this is their mother, Minnie. They called her Minnie in the middle. So I did write to Gail. And that started a correspondence between us from 1994 until her death at age 105 in 2010. And I still have every one of her letters, and I treasure them so much. And through Gail, I got to know some of Polly's nieces and nephews. Polly didn't have any children herself, but the family, Polly Smith's family, have just been wonderful to me, and I owe so much to both Gail and the nieces and nephews. So it was an amazing gift that I really treasure their openness with me. So as Valletta said, the Fair Park, I'm going to talk about the Centennial, give a little background to how she got to the Centennial. So as she said, the Fair Park had been there since 1886. And the park that we know was built in just 13 months. They had 13 months to transform old Fair Park into this new Fair Park. And so 13 months, they're doing all this building, but they had to do something else in those 13 months. And that is convince the entire US to forget that they have the Great Depression going on and come to Texas for this exposition. And just a quick note, there's the Centennial Exposition and the Centennial. The Centennial was a statewide celebration. The exposition was in Dallas. And they actually kind of fought in terms of who would get what funds. Polly worked for the exposition, so I did want to mention that. The exposition had this whole publicity team in Dallas, and they hired some in New York as well, because they wanted to get all that free publicity by placing stories in the national magazines. So they were, trying to sell that romantic and mythic part of Texas, but they were also trying to show that modern Texas was a great place to come and do business. So they were, cranking out all these press releases, all these stories, they were pitching them. But there was a hitch in all of this. When you're trying to sell a location as this great place to visit, what's worth 1,000 words? Yes, a picture. And pictures are what the Centennial did not have. At the time, there was no state tourism bureau. So there was no place you could go for images of the state, really. It had never been photographed for like tourism purposes. And you can see here, this is a letter that the publicity department sent to a chamber of commerce. And you can see up here that they sent that same letter to all these other chambers of commerce as well. They sent letters like this to the railway lines saying, hey, do you have photos of, places throughout Texas that you're traveling? They hit up every commercial photographer in the state asking if they would submit photos. I mean, they would practically beg these people. So, all this publicity is trying to go on, and they're really stopped dead because of the lack of photographs. Enter Polly Smith, a 27-year-old woman in Austin who was looking for a job. Polly was born Frances Sutah Smith, and there she is as a baby, on December 29th, 1907 in Ruston, Louisiana. Her parents were Roy and Marion Burke Smith, and she was the middle child of 7. Her name, like I said, was Frances, but they called her Polly because apparently when she was a child, she loved this song called Miss Polly Hopkins. So when going through census records and the like, it shows that her father, Roy, worked as a farmer, an insurance salesman, a newspaper salesman, and they moved all, oh, oops, let me go back. How do I go back? Go back. Yes, okay. They moved all over the state of Texas. And by 1913, they had settled in Whitney, Texas. And their last child, Flo, who we saw in that earlier picture, was born there in 1913. And this is Burke and Flo. Burke was one of Polly's younger brothers, sitting on the steps of their house in Whitney. Whitney was a turning point for the family because in 1916, the father, Roy, boarded a train out of Whitney and left the family. He never returned to them. And we don't know exactly why he did this. Polly's mother never said. But Polly's mother, Minnie, gathered all the children, all 7 children around the kitchen table. And she told them that their father had left and that she didn't expect him to return. But what she did tell them was, we have each other, we love each other, and we must help each other always, and we will get along. And they did. It's amazing the amount of success this family had. The oldest sister, Dorothy, was a very successful dress designer. Of course, C.R. Smith, who was a leader in the airline industry, American Airlines. There is Gail, who was the women's program director for the Texas State Radio Network. Here's our Polly. Bill, who was a very talented artist who worked on the murals in the Great Hall of the Hall of State. Burke, who was a very greatly loved aviation pioneer. And Flo, who was a really witty writer and journalist. In 1921, Minnie was appointed to a position in the state health department. So the family moved to Austin and settled here in this home on Rio Grande Avenue. But of course, their financial troubles did not disappear. So to make ends meet, what Minnie did was she started something that was actually publicly named the Smith Family Cooperative, and the Dallas Morning News called it a kind of human chess game. And what basically happened was the older children who had graduated from high school would go to work and then went to college part-time so that they can contribute money to the household. The younger children stayed in school and worked part-time and contributed money to the household. And you know, all of them did this together. And through this method, each child had the opportunity to get some college education. Polly graduated from Austin High School in 1925. She sang in the choir. She was active in the Literary Society. You can see she was elected class poet in her senior year. And my theory is that she got interested in photography in high school because when I looked at her 1924 yearbook, it talks about this Kodak camera club that was wildly popular at the school. So, you know, maybe that's where she got interested in it. In 1933, she took a photography class at the University of Texas, but she didn't finish it. Instead, she went to New York to attend the Clarence H. White School of Photography. And as was mentioned earlier by Lynn, White was a really noted photographer at the time. He had started the school. He had also taught at Columbia University, where he had taught Margaret Bourke-White, Dorothea Lange, Laura Gilpin, Carl Struess, all these top name people. He had died in 1925, but his wife and son continued running the school. So in the early days of my research about Polly, I had been told that Polly studied with Edward Steichen. I had been told that she studied with Margaret when I was, in fact, they actually called her the Margaret Bork White girl in some of the letters I've seen in the Centennial collection. But one day I was kind of going through stuff and I found this mention of the Clarence H. White School. I'm not a photography historian, so this was news to me. And White was a friend of Edward Steichen, had taught Margaret Bork White. So I thought, okay, here's a connection. And the school's records are actually housed at Princeton University. So I called at the Princeton Library and, you know, I'm talking to this guy on the phone saying, I'm looking for this random student who attended the Clarence H. White School 80 years ago. And I hear this tapping on a keyboard. And in about 30 seconds, he says, yes, she was a student at the school. Would you like me to email you her student work? So talk about serendipity again. You know, I'm a librarian, have been for many years, had been for many years when this happened, but getting that student work, I mean, just somebody's student work from 80 years ago, but it had been preserved in that library for this long, just waiting for somebody to come see it. That's the power of libraries. They're awesome. And organizations like Libraries and the Historical Society preserving this stuff, it's priceless. But back to Polly. 1935, she was she was here in Texas looking for a job. And jobs at the Centennial were not easy to get. So she had to know somebody. And William H. Cottrell, was the assistant to the general manager. So he was in a great position to hire people. Cottrell was really active in state politics, as was Polly's mother, Minnie. But my theory is that she actually got an in through J. Frank Dobie. Of course, he was a leading Texas writer and folklorist. Minnie actually lived across the street from the Dobies, and Mrs. Dobie and her would talk about gardens all the time. So I think Polly got introduced to Cottrell through J. Frank Dobie. So she gets hired in October 1935, 8 months before the opening of the exposition. And she and the Centennial came to an agreement of her being paid $500 a month to travel the state and take photos for the exposition's publicity department. And I admit I never really stopped to consider that figure until Peter made a point of talking to me about it. And $500 a month in 1936 is the equivalent to over $9,000 today. So I'd love to make $9,000 a month. But at the time, the only person who made more than her in the entire promotions division was the director, Frank Watson, at $650 a month. Now, Polly wasn't the only photographer for the exposition, but a lot of them worked there in the park. And, you had the picture of the girls, Lynn, and believe me, all those photo sheets, oh, let's get a picture of a cow. Make sure there's some girls there. And, they were big on photographing the girls, but she was the only one who was traveling the state taking photos for the exposition. And she's shown here at Alamo Downs in San Antonio. And that's her camera. It was a Graflex home portrait 5x7, and it weighed about 13 pounds. So, think a bowling ball. And when I was researching it, I got amused because the ads for this camera described it as compact and rugged. So the meaning of compact has clearly changed. So she signed a contract and got this 2-page assignment sheet. And I love over here, don't let it alarm you. And she probably needed that. This was, a huge professional assignment for her. She hadn't really done anything of this magnitude before. And you can see some of the shots she was asked to get. The pioneer shots, mohair, from goat to garment, scent to sackcloth, hoof to hide. Maybe, I guess, Clyde Vanderberg was a bit of a poet, perhaps. And then the hillbilly shots, cabins, cattle, that sort of thing. And that always amuses me too. Clyde Vandenberg was from Colorado and was living in California when he got the Centennial job. So maybe he just thought everything east of Colorado was hillbilly country. I don't know. But anyway, assignment sheet in hand, she set off across Texas, traveling by car and railroad. You can see it slow going, 45 miles per hour, which they considered slow even then. The roads weren't always paved everywhere. And when she was taking pictures, the weather didn't always cooperate. This is Houston, and she described it as cold, dark, and dreary. And she mentions battling police in San Antonio, trying to get shots planned. And it was in San Antonio that she really had a huge setback, and it was a setback for the exposition too. Somebody stole her camera and film from her unlocked car. And we don't have many details about the theft, but you know, she had to ride off to New York and get new equipment and everything like that. So she was really held up. She took the time to build a mobile darkroom on the back of a Ford truck she had. So that was something. And I'm really excited to see Ellen's photos of that later. So after she got the new equipment, she traveled west, and the society, not that I have seen, the society doesn't have as many of her Western photos. And I saw this, I was going through the Dallas Morning News and saw this, and you could see that she sold 1,000 prints of it. I'm like, what? I can't find one. So, but I published it in the book, and this guy wrote me back and said, I have it. And so he sent me this copy for it, and I just think it's amazing. So the Centennial used her photos to every conceivable outfit magazine. They used these photos for a woodworking magazine. They used these photos for a dairy magazine. You can see this photo of hers was used on the cover of a songbook that was distributed all over the state. And just really quickly, I want to show you a few favorites. This was one of Gail Muskovich's favorite photos of Polly's. And this one I included because her niece said she always liked the sky in Polly's photos. And this is my favorite because I love the title that Polly gave it, which is Cleaning a Stone Maid's Nails. Then, of course, the exposition opened, and the Hall of State finally opened in September. And Polly's photos were printed on the glass in those in the Hall of State. And she did not know this was going to happen. It was a surprise to her. So I want to finish up her career super quickly. After the Centennial, she kept busy at other photography jobs and worked at the Dallas Aviation School out at Love Field from 1939 to 1942. That's her, and her sister Flo worked there doing copy. And she continued to take photos. These were taken around 1940, and this was another moment of serendipity because I had read about a man who had a hobby shop in Irving. He was in his 90s, but had worked at the Dallas Aviation School. So I said, you know, maybe he knew Polly. Called him up. The son answers, and I'm telling what I'm looking for. He says, oh, I wonder if that's those photos we have in the back. And sure enough, Polly had thrown away slides at the Dallas Aviation School. This man dug them out of the trash and then hung on to them for over 50 years in the hobby shop. So these are definitely her photos. After the war, though, she slowly moved into the fields of painting and sculpture. And even though she had a really great career in photography, she moved away from that into the painting and sculpture field. And that's really what she concentrated on for the rest of her life after World War II. There's a shot of her sketching. And after World War II, she also became a much more private person. There were a couple of reasons for that. First was family reasons. Her mother became ill and she cared for her. And then her beloved sister Flo died of cancer in a little bit later. Polly herself had 2 episodes of breast cancer, the last one of which led to her death in 1980. And there were some mental health issues as well. She began suffering some mental health issues, which left her unable to work. But so she never married, she never had kids. She wasn't a prolific letter writer, unfortunately, but she was very close to her family. And in 1969, she moved into a guest house on her sister Gail's property in Auburn, California, where she lived for the rest of her life. But I don't want this to end on a bad note. And Gail, when in her letter, she made sure that I knew that. She told me that Polly had said to her, I've been happy all my life. And I love this photo of 3 of the sisters laughing together here. So, as I said, I never knew Polly personally, but I feel she would have been very honored that the society and the colleagues on this webinar are working so hard to preserve her photos. And I know her sister Gail would have been over the moon excited. She was such a staunch supporter of Polly's talent. I have a large picture of Polly here by my desk that I've looked at every day for many, many years. So, you know, as I wrap up, I want to say thank you to the people in this webinar and the people watching, because you're doing such great work helping to preserve these wonderful photos and this little slice of Texas from 1936. So thank you all so much.
Thanks, Evelyn. I find Polly to be one of the most compelling figures of the Centennial and its creation. So it's great. It's always great. I find, you know, I've become obsessed with her, so to speak. As Lynn said, she was swimming in those waters of creativity of the 1930s, the Dorothea Langes and so forth. And the photographers creating those photographs and those faces and those landscapes are still very much consequential today. But her influence did not end in the Centennial, because her work is with us today in the Hall of State, and part of the assessment of the artistic works in the building during this restoration, we looked at the photographs, her work, and the permanent display. And 18 of her photographs are the oratones. Next slide. As you can see, these are these are the oratones in the walls. Next slide. You can see close up some of the issues on this one. Okay, final one. There are 18 total oratones, and photograph conservator Liz Ann Gann assessed those works to help us determine the next steps in ensuring their protection. And although we do not have sufficient funding to do all of them, Liz Ann, we have had the funding to do one of those oratones. So Liz Ann's going to talk to you a little bit about the work she did with that single oratone. Liz Ann?
Thank you, Valletta. Thank you all so much for having me on this project and on this webinar. It's been really an exciting time to learn about Polly and explore her work. As Lynn mentioned earlier, I received an email from her and asking me to consult and examine some photographs that were on glass plates. And in the back of my mind, I was thinking, well, they're probably in a little box and we'll have to meet. She invited me out to Fair Park to examine them on site. And as we're walking through the corridors in the hall there, I was looking around at the tabletops thinking, well, the archive box should be here somewhere. And I asked her, well, where are the photographs? And she pointed to the wall, and I'm not quite sure what the actual expression on my face was, but I just remember thinking, they're so big. They're quite monumental in their size and exceptional that they've survived this long. As many of us know, things on glass don't tend to survive for very long periods of time, just due to their nature, that they break if something hits them or they fall. And so I started looking at these images and thinking, they're lovely. Who had the idea to make this type of, to use this process? First of all, they're very engaging. You walk in and they have a warm tone, but a slight reflective quality to them. And so I had more questions passing through my mind than I could possibly get out in the first 10 minutes of our conversation. But Lynn was very, very gracious and patient with me. And I tried to explain to her that the fact that all 18 had survived was nothing short of a miracle. And then to look around and see construction going on. So I immediately understood that we needed to take some actions to protect these as much as possible as the work progressed in the Hall of State. And so let me get to the first slide if I could. Okay, so this is an image of Dennis McGehee, and it gives you a bit of scale too, to see a human standing up next to one of Polly's oratones. We decided that it was going to be very difficult to assess the condition if we were not able to remove them from the wall. Typically within a conservation examination and assessment, you want to be able to, especially in the case of photographs and works of art on paper, you want to be able to remove the object from its frame and examine the back. And we were already able to see signs of deterioration up in the top edge. I think if you look up in the top edge of this image, you can see some green, blue corrosion and some slight signs of deterioration of the photograph itself. And so we just decided we needed a closer look, that this was going to be a joint effort because the paneling, all of the decorative arts that are in the Hall of State are historic. I mean, if you think about it, there are not many artisans floating around these days that can create doors and lights such as these to this quality. And it was original material, so we wanted to be sure and protect the surroundings as well as the image itself. So the day came that we proposed to deinstall one to two of the oratones, and we began by removing the molding around the edges. And we selected the cotton balers, this image that Lynn showed earlier. It took a couple of people to safely lift it down from the wall. And again, if you take a look at the top edge of the image, you can see some signs of deterioration in the silver image material. And so I was really looking for signs of water damage after we had done a little tour. And this was one of the ones that I selected, not necessarily because it's a beautiful image, but because I wanted to get to the bottom of what were the conservation and stability issues for this object. The corrosion along the top edge was something that I was concerned about. We were looking for water damage, and then this very unusual modeling that had appeared inside the images. We were thinking that it could be mold. So once we got the orotone off of the wall, we see right away that there are no signs of water damage, except along that top edge. So we still see this green corrosion. Something has come in along the top, and we're trying to figure out what this object has seen over its lifetime. And of course, we have this massive copper frame along the edges, and it's not mechanically installed into its frame. It's literally soldered into the frame. So that poses a bit of a second obstacle for us to complete the examination. And so we start looking at what needs to be done to really complete the examination. This is an image of the backing board, and you can see they used an older type of linen tape, and the backing board has been varnished. And up in the top right and the lower left, you can see the soldered corner reinforcements. And here's a detail of the metal corrosion. So, and just below that green layer, you can see the surface of the photograph. So you're starting to see interference colors, some image corrosion, and I'm expecting the worst. I still want to get to the bottom of what this is. But the other restriction that we're faced with is the overall size. So glass breaks. It's difficult to maneuver. It can be heavy. It requires 2 or 3 people. But we're getting small signs from the examination. So we decide to remove the frame. Along the way, I'm trying to document bits and pieces of the history, because a bit like an archaeological dig, once you remove some components, you're not able to put them back exactly as they were installed. So I know that removing the frame, we're not going to be able to reinstall this object into its frame exactly as it was seen, without either resoldering, which would involve heat, and that's risky, or making a new frame. And this is a detail of the Fox Company stamp. It's a little engraved and stamped, gold stamped insignia at the bottom of each one of the oratones that gave us our first clue that these were made by the Fox Company, which later became what was known to all of us as Fox Photo. They were ultimately bought out by Kodak and then repurchased, and I think morphed most recently into Wolf Camera. This is a detail of one of the oratones. Looking through the front of the glass plate, you see all of this modeling, and this is what was concerning in terms of possibility for mold, flaking. I'm just hoping at this point that we're not going to have a flaking emulsion. Oratones are a process that is a positive on a glass plate, our transparent support. And so in this case, Polly's oratones are a gelatin silver emulsion on this glass plate that has been sepia toned, but we still didn't know how many layers there were. Typically an ortone can be 1 to 2 layers with a gold paint or gold leaf as the backing material, or the gold paint or gold leaf can be applied to a secondary plate. Those oratones tend to survive a little bit better without deterioration issues as much as the single plate version. This is a detail of the back of the oratone after we removed the backing board, and what you're able to see here are corrosion pitting. These little oily spots are actually the electroplating that has started to corrode and oxidize through bubbles that were in the paint layer, the protective paint layer on the back of the mirror. We found a stamp that let us know that these were from the Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company, and so that became yet another thread to follow, looking for the Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company archives. So this is a detail of Objects Conservator Michael Van Enter assisting us in removing the frame. And what we discovered once that frame was off was that this is a very unusual variation of the ortone process. This is a 3-plate composition. in the plate package, and the uppermost plate, you have the Ortone itself, the glass plate. On this interior layer would be the gelatin silver image. This second plate is an etched glass, which serves as a diffuser. And then this bottom plate is a mirror, the copper plated mirror. And you can see the residue of desiccated pressure sensitive tapes that were used to seal the edges. So this is a detail of the reverse. And at this point, I'm already knowing that these tapes are not going to last. We're going to have to remove these tapes in order for the object to be preserved. Going into the future, pressure sensitive tapes tend to be a bit of a bad actor. They stain, and they can also remove bits of the emulsion. So we determined that the oxidation of the mirror was our culprit rather than mold, which was a huge collective sigh of relief for us, because that's a lesser issue to deal with. But we would still be confronted with trying to make fills in these loss areas. And part of the goal of conservation is sometimes not to make a treatment that would be an intervention where we couldn't remove it in the future, or it would cause further damage. We wanted it to be more of a preservation effort. So one of those was that we would use a fill material of a silvered mylar to place behind the mirror that would allow us to still have a reflection that would bring the light back out through this image that Polly had made, and without adding any additional material directly to the surface. So the day came that we were able to organize everybody, and I went on site into the Hall estate to treat the object. This is an image of me working. Of course, normally conservators have PPE, such as respirators and masks, but now we have a whole new level of PPE going on with COVID. So I was trying to remove the residue at this point of the adhesive tapes. And here's an image. I'm almost finished at this point. Finally, we have I should say that we have noticed that there are variations of Ortones all throughout time. Whenever you have an emulsion that can be on a transparent support, you back it with gold, and you're going to have this principle. And there are many photographers that have embraced this new process as part of a resurgence in photographic processes. And at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Ellen Leathers-Wishart, because she is going to take you through some of the contemporary versions of the Ortone process and discuss all of the options if anyone is interested in pursuing this.
Thank you so much, Lizanne, and thank you everyone. This webinar is especially exciting to me, being a photographer from Dallas, Texas, currently living in Dallas, Texas, and being a woman photographer. So this is all very interesting. And yeah, I'll talk a little bit more about what Ortones are and how they can be made. As Lizanne mentioned before, Ortones are basically a photographic image on a transparent support. Let me get this slide situation figured out. Okay. So that just means an image or emulsion is on glass or mylar that is then backed with gold by applying paint or gold leaf. And there are two basic ways to create an image like this. You can expose a piece of glass directly from your camera using a direct positive process, such as wet plate collodion, which is what I do, or you can create an image onto a piece of glass from a negative with an enlarger, which is what Polly Smith's photographs are. The Polly Smith oratones are basically gigantic positives, 38 by 32 inches, that were created from negatives. Her photographs were exposed onto very large pieces of glass instead of paper, which is what we are mostly familiar with. So oratones can be made of various ways, using albumin, collodion on glass, silver gelatin dry plates, carbon transfer on glass, and inkjet on mylar. This is an example of a silver gelatin glass plate that Lizanne and D. Anson Brody, a photographer in Fort Worth, created. And here it is backed with gold paint. This is another image from Lizanne on mylar, which is basically just clear paper that's also backed with gold paint. And here are some other examples of gold on glass. The top is just acrylic paint. The middle is gold leaf on varnish. And the bottom is acrylic paint, again, diluted with water. And here's some various colors of gold paint on glass. Here's me painting on gold leaf paint on glass. And here is an oratone that I created with collodion directly on a copper mirror. So when I create an oratone, I chose collodion since it's the emulsion that I'm most familiar with, and exposing directly on a mirror it made it easier to have a very even coating of metallic gold or copper on the background. Sometimes you can see the brush strokes of the gold, which also looks interesting. So to create this image, I basically take a clean piece of mirror. I pour on collodion to create an even layer of emulsion. Then I soak the plate in a silver bath, which is basically silver nitrate suspended in water, where the salts and the collodion or emulsion absorb the silver to make the plate light sensitive. I then transfer the plate to a light safe plate holder that I place in my camera to expose directly. Now, without letting the plate dry out, which is why it's called wet plate collodion, I take it back to my darkroom where I carefully pour on developer and watch for the medium tones to appear, usually around 10 seconds. I stop the development with water, then pour on rapid fix to dissolve all the silver halides that were not exposed to light, leaving me with a direct positive image on the plate. Once the plate is washed and dried, I need to varnish the image to protect the thin and very delicate layer of silver from wiping off. The wet plate collodion process requires a lot of light, having an ISO of only 0.2. I generally shoot with my lens aperture wide open. In this case, it's f6.3, and I used 4,400 watt seconds of strobe lighting, which is a lot of light for those of you who are familiar with strobes. And when taking a collodion photograph outdoors with my lens wide open, the exposure ranges from 1 to 10 seconds, depending on the sun. And I'd also like to note, when shooting on glass, I need to make sure that there's a very dense layer of silver, that the image is very strong, which I can manipulate during the development. If I overdevelop slightly, the image will be a little bit brighter and create a stronger emulsion layer. The wet plate collodion process requires me to have a darkroom very close to me where I'm taking my photographs. And as Evelyn mentioned before, I've included this image of me with my darkroom on the back of my truck, as Polly had hers on the back of her Ford truck. And here is my entire studio that also has a small dark room inside of it. I'm also inside my studio now. So the earliest examples of oratones that we see are collodion on glass, which was when, so wet plate collodion was introduced in 1851 by Frederick Scott Archer, and then dominated the photography scene until about the 1880s when silver gelatin was invented. So the polysmith oratones were created rather late, and given the timeline of the popularity of oratones, hers were created in 1936, and oratones were mostly popular from 1900 to the 1920s. Oratones have continued to appear periodically up until the 1950s and have regained some popularity today with contemporary photographers. As new photographic processes were invented, others fell in and out of popularity depending on how costly or complicated they were. Wet plate collodion, as well as other historical photographic processes, has regained a lot of popularity within the last decade. When I was in art history class, my teacher told me that when photography was invented, painting portraits would cease to exist. And when digital photography was invented, it was said that analog or film photography would die. Luckily, that is not the case. And I, among many others, are keeping many of these historical methods alive and even available. So like me, there are many other studios around the world that exist where you can get your own portrait made in various historical various historical processes, especially wet plate collodion. And there's an even greater number of photography enthusiasts who use various historical processes as their art form. So I hope this gives you a better understanding of what an oratone is and how it can be made. And again, I'm just really excited to be a part of this. And thank you so much. I'll give it back to Peter.
The process that Ellen just got through talking about, the tintype process and wet plate collodion, that's something that we teach workshops in, not right now, because gathering a group of people to work in a dark room for hours on end seems not like a great idea right now. We do have time for a couple of questions. If anybody's got anything, there was an earlier question that came up that I think Ellen already answered, which is, do the original negatives exist for photos on the oratone? And yes, the difference between an oratone and a tintype, for example, is a tintype is the original plate that goes in the camera and is processed. There's only one. In this case, all of the negatives of Polly's work are actually with the Dallas Historical Society. And from there, they are enlarged onto the glass plates. So it's a reproducible process. As far as I know, these are the only 18 that were ever made, the only 18 oratones that were ever made. There have been other exhibits of her work in the past, but these are the only ones. We have time for just another question or two. Does anybody have anything? Pop it in the Q&A. If not, any of our panelists have anything to say or add?
Well, the only thing that I would bring up is we have been fortunate to be able to restore one of these, but we still have 17 more to go in the Hall of State. So we will be going more public with that, making grant applications, and there will be opportunities for people to sort of participate in saving more of these. So I wanted everyone to know that.
Yeah, the Hall of State is such a treasure anyway, but these oratones, now that I've had a chance to go up and look at them close, the problem is the closer you get, the more the problems show up.
Right.
They're nice at a distance, but they really sing when you get close to them. When you get close to them, you see all of the degradation problems. So getting those things, getting that degradation stopped would be a really big deal. We are going to be sending out, first of all, thank you so much to our panelists. A lot of work and practice went into this. We're going to be sending out a follow-up email to everybody who registered. There will be links in that email for how to view all of Polly's photos, how to buy Evelyn's book, and where to book a tintype session with Ellen, and any news that we can get from anyone about the Fair Park restoration. We have another webinar coming up in November around the anniversary of JFK. It's going to be a physician here in town who was actually on duty in DC during the memorial and the burial of President Kennedy. And he's got some astounding photographs that he took that have really never been shown anywhere. He's a sort of photography client of ours. So please consider joining DCP, Dallas Center for Photography. It helps us continue programs like this. Times are tough right now for everybody. So a vote of confidence would be welcome. So thank you, everybody. And hopefully we'll see you next month.